They called her tainted, unworthy, a stain on the pack's purity. But when the Alpha opened the ancient lunar scroll during the harvest moon ceremony, her name blazed in silver light, written in the language of the first wolves, beside his own. Everything he believed about bloodlines, about destiny, about her, shattered in that single moment. And if you want to see how a condemned Omega becomes the one thing an Alpha can't live without, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment, telling me what you think happens when the pack discovers the truth, because this story is about to get intense. The Silvercrest pack had rules older than memory itself, laws carved into stone and bone, passed down through generations like sacred scripture, and the most unbreakable of all was this: only pure-blooded Omegas could stand beside an Alpha. Only those whose lineage traced back to the founding families without a single drop of dilution, without a whisper of doubt. Sarah had grown up knowing she would never be one of them, that her mother's scandal, a union with a wolf from outside the territory, a rogue whose name was never spoken aloud, had marked her before she even drew her first breath, had stained her with a shame she could never wash away, no matter how hard she tried, no matter how perfectly she served, no matter how invisible she made herself. She lived on the edges of pack life, in a small cottage near the border, where the forest grew thick and dark, where the howls of her own people sounded distant and cold, where she worked as a healer's assistant because it was the only role they would allow someone like her, someone whose very existence was a reminder of broken laws and tarnished honor. Alpha Demon Silvercrest had been raised to lead with absolute certainty, to never question the ancient ways, to uphold the traditions that had kept their pack strong for centuries. And he wore that responsibility like armor, cold and impenetrable, never allowing himself the luxury of doubt or the weakness of mercy. He had seen Sarah countless times over the years, had noticed her moving through the healing halls with quiet efficiency, had watched her lower her eyes whenever he passed, had felt nothing but vague discomfort at her presence because she represented everything his world rejected: impurity, contamination, the dangerous possibility that their carefully maintained bloodlines meant nothing. When his father died and the mantle of leadership fell to him, Demon's first act was to reinforce the old laws, to make it clear that Silvercrest would not soften, would not change, would not allow sentiment to corrupt what generations had built. And everyone understood that meant Omegas like Sarah would remain exactly where they were, forgotten, dismissed, condemned to live in the shadows of a pack that would never claim them. The harvest moon ceremony came as it did every 50 years, a night when the lunar eclipse aligned with the autumn equinox, when the ancient lunar scroll was brought out from the sacred vault deep beneath the pack house, when the Alpha was required to read the names of those destined for greatness, for leadership, for the bonds that would shape the next half-century. Demon had prepared for this moment his entire life, had memorized the rituals, had fasted for 3 days to purify himself, had stood before the assembled pack with perfect confidence as the elders placed the scroll in his hands, the parchment, so old it felt like holding moonlight itself, fragile and impossibly precious. The ceremony required him to open it under the full eclipse, to read the names aloud as they appeared in silver script that only an Alpha's eyes could see, names that would glow and fade, marking destinies that even the moon goddess herself had woven into fate. He had expected to see the usual names, the daughters of the founding families, the pure-blooded Omegas who had been groomed since childhood for this honor, the ones everyone assumed would be listed there because that was how it had always been, how it was supposed to be. But when Demon unrolled the scroll under the crimson light of the eclipsed moon, when he looked down at the ancient script flowing across the parchment like liquid silver, his breath stopped in his chest because there, burning brighter than any other name, brighter than his own, was a name that should not exist, that could not exist, that shattered everything he thought he knew. Sarah Moonwhisper, daughter of the broken bond, written in the old language, the true language, the words, that predated their laws and their prejudices, and their carefully constructed hierarchies. Beside her name was his, intertwined in a pattern that meant something more than alliance, more than duty, something that spoke of souls bound across lifetimes, of a connection that transcended blood and breeding and every rule his ancestors had ever created. The scroll didn't lie. It couldn't lie. It was woven with magic older than the pack itself, older than the territories, older than the first wolves who learned to walk on two legs and call themselves civilized. Demon's hands trembled as he stared at those glowing letters, as the truth of what he was seeing crashed into him like a physical blow. Because accepting this meant rejecting everything, meant admitting that the laws he had sworn to uphold were built on arrogance and ignorance, meant facing the fact that he had allowed an Omega destined to stand beside him to live in exile and shame, to suffer for years under the weight of a condemnation she never deserved. He looked up slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd of assembled pack members, all of them waiting expectantly for him to announce the names, to confirm what they already believed they knew, and his gaze found her standing at the very back, half hidden, behind a pillar, wearing the plain gray dress that marked her status, her dark hair pulled back severely, her face carefully blank in that way she had perfected, that mask of emptiness that kept her safe from notice, from cruelty, from hope. Their eyes met across the distance, and Demon saw something flicker in her expression, a flash of confusion, of fear, as if she sensed something had gone terribly wrong, as if she knew somehow that the ground beneath all of them was about to crack open and swallow everything they thought was solid and true. He should have announced it immediately, should have spoken her name into the night and let the consequences fall where they may. But the weight of tradition held his tongue, the faces of the elders surrounding him, stern and expectant. The memory of his father's voice telling him that a leader who breaks faith with the old ways loses the right to lead at all. So Damon did something he would regret for the rest of his life. He rolled the scroll back up without speaking, announced that the reading would be delayed, that he needed time to consult with the moon goddess privately, and dismissed the ceremony. With words that tasted like ash in his mouth, like cowardice dressed up as wisdom. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring confusion and disappointment, and Sarah vanished into the darkness before he could stop her, before he could explain something he didn't even understand himself. And Demon was left standing alone under the fading eclipse, holding a scroll that had just destroyed his entire world and didn't care at all about the wreckage it left behind. For 3 days, Demon locked himself in the sacred chamber with the scroll, reading it over and over, searching for some mistake, some trick of the light, some way to make what he saw align with what he had always believed. But the truth remained, stubbornly unchanged. Sarah's name glowed beside his, and beneath it, in smaller script, was a genealogy that traced her line back further than his own. Back to the very first Omega who had walked beside the moon goddess herself. A bloodline so pure it made the founding families look like pretenders, like children playing at nobility. Her mother's bond with the rogue hadn't diluted her heritage. It had preserved it, had kept it hidden from those who would have exploited it or destroyed it. And the shame that had defined Sarah's entire existence was nothing more than ignorance, weaponized into cruelty. Demon felt something crack open inside his chest as he traced those silver letters with his finger, felt the weight of every cold glance he had given her, every time he had walked past her without acknowledgement, every moment he had allowed her to suffer because it was easier than questioning what he had been taught. And the guilt was so overwhelming, it brought him to his knees on the cold stone floor, alone in the darkness, confronting the truth of what he was. Not a righteous leader upholding sacred law, but a man who had condemned his own destined mate to a life of exile and pain because he was too afraid to see beyond the lies he had inherited. The pack house was in chaos when Demon finally emerged, because word had spread that something was wrong, that the Alpha had hidden himself away, that the ceremony had been incomplete, and into that vacuum of uncertainty stepped Margiv, the daughter of the first elder, the Omega everyone had assumed would be named in the scroll. Beautiful and proud, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. She had waited her entire life for this moment, had been groomed for it, had built her identity around the certainty that she would stand beside the Alpha, and Demon's silence had driven her to desperation masked as righteous concern. She gathered. The other high-born Omegas around her filled their ears with poison dressed as worry, suggested that perhaps the Alpha had been corrupted somehow, that the scroll had been tampered with, that dark magic was at work, and slowly, carefully, she turned their attention toward the one Omega who had always been an easy target, the one whose very existence offended their sense of order and propriety, Sarah. It started with whispers, then escalated to accusations, then exploded into open demands that Sarah be questioned, examined, punished for whatever dark influence she must have exerted to corrupt the sacred ceremony. Because how else could an Alpha abandon tradition unless he had been compromised? Unless someone impure had worked forbidden magic to cloud his judgment? Margaive led a group of enforcers to Sarah's cottage in the gray hours before dawn, dragged her from her bed, hauled her to the pack-house courtyard where a crowd had already gathered, hungry for spectacle, for confirmation of their prejudices, for the satisfaction of seeing someone they had always despised finally get what they believed she deserved. Sarah didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't beg. She had learned long ago that resistance only made things worse, that the best way to survive was to disappear inside herself, to let them do whatever they needed to do to feel powerful, to feel righteous, to feel clean. Demon heard the commotion from the sacred chamber, heard the shouting and the sound of something shattering, and when he burst into the courtyard, what he saw stopped his heart. Sarah on her knees in the center of a circle of pack members, her wrists bound with silver cord that burned her skin, her face pale but defiant in a way he had never seen before, and Margaive standing over her like a prosecutor delivering judgment, her voice ringing across the courtyard with accusations of witchcraft, of corruption, of crimes against the pack that demanded blood as payment. The crowd was agreeing, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation, and Demon realized with sick certainty that if he didn't act immediately, didn't claim her right now in front of all of them, they would kill her before the sun finished rising, would erase her from existence, and never admit they had murdered the purest bloodline their pack had ever known. He moved without thinking, his Alpha command crashing across the courtyard like thunder, silencing every voice, freezing every movement, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that brooked no argument, no hesitation, no defiance. He told them the truth, all of it, about what the scroll revealed, about Sarah's lineage, about the destiny that bound them together, about the generations of lies they had all swallowed without question. And he watched their faces shift from certainty to confusion to dawning horror as they realized what they had done, what they had almost done, how close they had come to destroying something irreplaceable. Margaive's face went white, then red, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as her entire world collapsed around her, as every dream she had cherished turned to ash. And Demon felt no pity for her at all, because she had been willing to murder an innocent Omega to maintain her delusion of superiority. And that was unforgivable. That was the kind of rot that had infected his pack for far too long. He knelt beside Sarah, cut the silver cords himself despite the way they burned his hands. And when her eyes met his, he saw something that nearly broke him. Not gratitude, not relief, but a deep, aching wariness. The look of someone who has been hurt so many times that kindness feels like a trap, that rescue feels like the prelude to a different kind of violation. She didn't trust him. Why should she? He was the one who had read her name and hidden it, who had chosen protocol over truth, who had let her remain condemned for 3 more days while he wrestled with his own cowardice. When he reached out to help her stand, she flinched away from his touch, and that small, involuntary movement struck him harder than any blow, made him understand that claiming her before the pack was only the first step, that earning her trust, her forgiveness, her acceptance would be the work of years, maybe lifetimes, and he had no right to expect any of it. But before Demon could say anything, could try to explain or apologize or bridge the chasm of pain that separated them, a howl split the morning air, coming from the northern border. The alarm that meant intruders, enemies, danger. The pack's attention shifted immediately, instincts overriding confusion. And within moments the enforcers were mobilizing, preparing to defend the territory, and in the chaos Demon lost sight of Sarah, saw her slip away from the courtyard while everyone's attention was elsewhere, disappearing like smoke, like a ghost who had never really been there at all. He wanted to go after her to make sure she was safe, to keep her close where he could protect her from anyone who still clung to the old prejudices. But duty demanded he lead the defense, demanded he face whatever threat had breached their borders, and so he ran north with his enforcers, leaving his destined mate alone and unguarded, trusting that she would be safe within Packlands now that the truth was known, now that her name had been spoken aloud with the authority of the lunar scroll behind it. The northern incursion turned out to be rogues, a small group testing their defenses, easily repelled, but it took hours to sweep the territory and ensure no others remained hidden. And by the time Demon returned to the pack house, the sun was high and his mind was screaming at him to find Sarah, to make sure she was all right, to begin the impossible task of making amends. He went to her cottage first, found it empty, the door hanging open, her few possessions scattered as if she had left in a hurry, and the fear that seized his chest was immediate and consuming, because he knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong. That while he had been chasing rogues, something worse had happened here, something he should have prevented. He followed her scent, tracking it through the forest, and what he found made rage explode through his veins like poison, signs of a struggle. Blood on the leaves and Margive's scent tangled with Sarah's, leading deeper into the woods, toward the cliffs that overlooked the ravine, toward a place where accidents happened and bodies disappeared and questions went conveniently unanswered. Demon ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his wolf surging to the surface, transformation rippling through him mid-stride. And when he burst through the tree line onto the cliff edge, he saw them, Margive and two other high-born Omegas, dragging a barely conscious Sarah toward the drop, their faces twisted with hatred and desperation, with the fury of those who had lost everything and wanted someone to pay for it, wanted someone to bleed for their shattered dreams. Margive was screaming something about justice, about protecting the pack from corruption, about how Sarah had always been an abomination and always would be, no matter what some dusty scroll claimed. And Demon understood in that moment that she had gone completely mad, that her entire identity had been so wrapped up in being chosen that losing it had broken something fundamental inside her, had turned her into something dangerous and unhinged and willing to commit murder to reclaim what she thought was rightfully hers. His alpha command hit them like a physical force, dropping all three of them to their knees, releasing their hold on Sarah, who collapsed at the cliff's edge, too weak to move, too hurt to save herself. And Demon was there in seconds, pulling her back from the drop, cradling her against his chest as she trembled and bled and finally let herself break. Let the tears come. Let the pain she had been holding inside for years pour out against his shoulder while he held her and promised things he didn't know if he could deliver. Promised safety and acceptance and a life where she would never have to hide again, never have to make herself small, never have to carry shame that was never hers to begin with. He felt the bond then, truly felt it for the first time. The connection that the scroll had named, and it was overwhelming, it was terrifying. It was the most right thing he had ever experienced, like finding a part of himself he hadn't known was missing, like breathing after a lifetime of suffocation. The three Omegas were arrested, would face judgment before the Pack Council, and Margive screamed the entire way back to the pack house, her voice hoarse with fury and denial. But Demon barely heard her because all his attention was on Sarah, on the Omega in his arms who had survived years of cruelty and condemnation and had somehow not let it destroy the gentle core of who she was. The kindness he saw in the way she worked with the sick and injured, the strength it took to remain soft in a world that had shown her nothing but hardness. He carried her to the Alpha's quarters, called for the pack's best healers, stood guard outside the door while they tended to her injuries. And when they finally emerged and told him she would recover, that nothing was permanently damaged, the relief that flooded through him was so intense, it drove him to his knees right there in the hallway. Gratitude and guilt and love all tangled together into something too large for his chest to contain. When Sarah woke hours later in a bed that was absurdly soft, in a room that smelled like pine and night air, and something distinctly masculine, distinctly alpha, she experienced a moment of pure disorientation, of not knowing where she was or how she had gotten there. And then memory crashed back and she sat up too quickly. gasping at the pain that lanced through her ribs, her head spinning as she tried to process everything that had happened, everything that had changed. Demon was there immediately, emerging from where he had been sitting in the corner watching over her. And his face was so full of concern, of genuine anguish, that Sarah didn't know what to do with it, didn't have any experience with an alpha who looked at her like she mattered, like her pain caused him pain, like her existence was something precious rather than shameful. He asked if she needed anything, if he should call the healers back, if there was anything at all he could do to make her more comfortable. And his voice was gentle in a way she had never heard it before, stripped of command and authority, just a man trying to care for someone he had failed to protect. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, this alpha who had condemned her with his silence and saved her with his truth. This man whose name was written beside hers in silver script that claimed they were meant to orbit each other like moon and earth. Bound by gravity, neither of them had chosen, and she felt anger and gratitude warring in her chest, felt the injustice of being told her entire life she was worthless, only to discover she was priceless, felt the impossibility of trusting someone who represented everything that had hurt her, even if he was also the one fighting to keep her safe. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse but steady, and what she said was this: she didn't know if she could forgive him, didn't know if she could forgive any of them, didn't know if a name on a scroll could erase years of systematic cruelty, but she was willing to try, willing to see if there was something worth building in the ruins of what had been destroyed, willing to give him the chance he probably didn't deserve, but that she was choosing to offer anyway, because holding on to hate would only poison her further, and she was so tired of carrying toxic things inside her chest. Demon accepted her words with something like reverence, understood that what she was giving him was a gift beyond price, a fragile possibility that he would spend the rest of his life trying to prove himself worthy of. And he made her a promise there in the quiet of his quarters, with moonlight spilling through the windows. He would dismantle every law that had enabled her suffering, would rebuild the pack's foundations on truth rather than prejudice, would make sure every Omega knew their worth regardless of bloodline or circumstance, would spend however long it took to create a world where someone like her would never again have to hide, to shrink, to accept condemnation as the price of existence. It was an enormous promise, maybe an impossible one. But Sarah saw the determination burning in his eyes, the bone-deep commitment to change. And she understood that this wasn't just about her anymore, wasn't just about their bond. It was about choosing to be better than what they had inherited, about refusing to pass pain down to the next generation simply because it had been passed to them. The Pack Council met 3 days later, and Demon stood before them with the lunar scroll unfurled. Let them read for themselves what he had read. Let them confront the truth they had spent generations avoiding. And he watched ancient certainties crumble as elder after elder admitted that perhaps they had been wrong. Perhaps purity had never been about blood, but about character. Perhaps the moon goddess had been trying to tell them this for centuries, and they had been too arrogant to listen. Margiv and her accomplices were stripped of rank and exiled, sent beyond the borders with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And if there was anyone who thought the punishment too harsh, they kept it to themselves because attempted murder of a destined mate was unforgivable, was the kind of crime that demanded absolute consequences. The pack would heal, eventually, would learn to function under new rules, new understandings, new possibilities, but it would take time, would require patience and persistence, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. And Demon was prepared for all of it, because the alternative, returning to the way things were, was unthinkable now that he had seen the truth. Sarah moved through the following weeks in a strange dream state, learning what it felt like to walk through packlands without lowering her eyes, to enter rooms without automatic apology, to speak her thoughts without fear of punishment. And it was disorienting, it was uncomfortable, it required her to unlearn reflexes she had developed for survival, to trust that the safety she was experiencing was real and not some elaborate trap waiting to snap shut around her. Demon gave her space but remained close, a constant presence that never demanded but always offered, always made it clear that she could approach or retreat as she needed, that he would wait however long it took for her to feel secure enough to let him closer, to let the bond between them develop at its own pace rather than forced into being by obligation or expectation. They talked late into the night sometimes, conversations that ranged from superficial to profound, sharing histories and wounds and hopes, building a foundation of understanding that went deeper than destiny, deeper than names on ancient scrolls, into the territory of genuine connection between two people learning to see each other clearly. The first time Sarah laughed in his presence, really laughed with her whole body, her head thrown back and joy spilling from her like light, Demon felt something fundamental shift in his chest, felt the bond strengthen and solidify, felt his wolf settle in a way it never had before, as if some restless searching had finally found its destination. She was beautiful when she laughed, was beautiful when she was serious, was beautiful in her anger and her sadness and every expression in between. And he understood that what he felt for her went far beyond the bond, beyond destiny, into the realm of choice, of actively choosing to love her for who she was rather than what she represented, of wanting her happiness more than his own comfort, of being willing to dismantle himself and rebuild differently if that was what it took to be worthy of standing beside her. The pack's transformation was slow but steady, old prejudices giving way to new awareness, traditional hierarchies softening as people began to understand that worth came from character rather than bloodline. And Sarah became an unlikely symbol of this change, a living reminder that what they had dismissed as tainted was actually sacred, that their arrogance had nearly cost them something irreplaceable. She trained to become a full healer, not just an assistant, discovered talents and abilities she had never been allowed to develop, and found purpose in helping others heal the same wounds she carried, in using her pain as medicine for those who suffered under similar condemnation. Demon watched her bloom with fierce pride, saw her grow into her power, into her place, into the destiny that had always been waiting for her, even when the world insisted she was nothing. And he fell more in love with her every day, fell in love with her strength, her compassion, her refusal to become bitter despite having every reason to embrace bitterness. 6 months after the harvest moon ceremony, during the winter solstice gathering, Demon stood before the assembled pack with Sarah beside him, no longer hiding in the back, no longer making herself small, and he spoke the words that made their bond official, that claimed her before witnesses as his mate, his equal, his chosen partner in all things. And when he marked her and she marked him in return, the bond snapped fully into place, complete and unbreakable, and it felt like coming home, like finding the other half of a song he had been singing alone his entire life. The pack celebrated, genuinely celebrated, because most of them had come to love her in the months since the truth emerged, had seen her kindness and her strength and her grace, had understood that she was exactly the kind of Omega their pack needed, exactly the kind of leader who would balance Demon's intensity with compassion, his certainty with empathy, his strength with wisdom. That night, alone in their quarters with moonlight painting silver across the floor, Sarah and Demon lay tangled together, the bond humming between them like music, like prayer, like the universe confirming that yes, this was right, this was meant, this was the shape of destiny when you stopped fighting it and allowed it to unfold naturally. Sarah traced patterns on his chest, felt his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm, and said quietly that she forgave him, truly forgave him, not because he had earned it, through grand gestures or public declarations, but because holding on to resentment was exhausting, and she would rather spend her energy building something new than maintaining walls around old wounds. Demon pulled her closer, buried his face in her hair, and thanked her with words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she was giving him. The grace of her forgiveness, the gift of her trust, the miracle of her love freely offered despite everything. They built a life together in the months and years that followed. Not a perfect life because perfection was a myth and they were both too scarred to believe in fairy tales, but a real life, a honest life, a life where mistakes were acknowledged and growth was constant, and love was the foundation everything else was built upon. Sarah became a respected healer and counselor, someone the pack turned to in times of crisis, someone whose wisdom was sought and valued, and Demon ruled with a justice tempered by mercy, with strength balanced by compassion, with the understanding that leadership was service rather than domination. They had children eventually, pups who carried both their bloodlines, both their strengths, both their stories, and they raised them in a pack that had learned to measure worth by character rather than ancestry, that understood purity was a matter of heart rather than blood, that knew the most sacred bonds were often the ones that looked broken until you learned to see them correctly. The lunar scroll remained in its sacred chamber, but its purpose had changed. No longer a tool for reinforcing hierarchy, but a reminder that destiny often contradicts expectation. That truth exists beyond tradition, that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is admit they were wrong and commit to being better. Other packs heard the story of Silvercrest's transformation, of the condemned Omega who became its heart, of the Alpha who chose truth over comfort, and some of them began asking questions, began examining their own prejudices, began wondering what else they might be wrong about, what other sacred truths might actually be beautiful lies that needed to die so something better could be born. And on nights when the moon was full and silver light flooded the world, Sarah and Demon would stand together at the edge of the forest, their hands intertwined, their bond glowing bright and certain between them. And they would remember the night everything changed, the night her name blazed in ancient script beside his, the night destiny and choice and courage all conspired to rewrite a story that everyone thought was already finished. She was condemned, yes, marked as impure, cast aside as unworthy, but that condemnation was never true, was only ever ignorance masquerading as wisdom. And when the truth finally emerged, it didn't just save her, it saved all of them, gave them permission to see differently, to be different, to build something better from the ruins of their inherited mistakes. That was the real magic of the Lunar Scroll, the real gift of destiny. Not that it forced them into predetermined roles, but that it showed them possibilities they had been too blind to see, gave them the courage to question what they thought was unquestionable, gave them a chance to choose love over law, truth over tradition, and each other over the weight of a world that insisted they were wrong to want something better than what they had been given. They never knew if they had made the right choices, not really, because the future remained unwritten and transformation was messy and incomplete. And there were still wolves who whispered that the old ways were better, that Sarah's acceptance was a mistake that would reveal itself eventually. But what mattered was this: they tried, they kept trying. They refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to remain. And on the night of their mating ceremony, as silver light blessed them both, Sarah looked into Demon's eyes and saw not certainty but commitment, not perfection but genuine effort. And she understood that maybe that was enough, maybe that was everything. Maybe love was not about destiny forcing your hand, but about choosing each day to build something better than what you inherited. Together, one difficult decision at a time, until the story of what you were became less important than the story of what you were becoming. If you made it this far, thank you for witnessing Sarah's journey from condemnation to recognition. Subscribe to see more stories where the rejected become the revered, where destiny rewrites injustice, and where love proves stronger than every law designed to keep it apart. Drop a comment telling me which ending resonated most with you, and check out the playlist for more Alpha Reverse tales where broken bonds become unbreakable.